Then you have in 1956 a Suez Canal crisis. That was, so we can look at here, see specifically what happened. Yeah, so the central bank raised interest rates and economic growth. So let's look at the charts over here. Yeah, so this drawdown in the markets. What caused it was central banks raising interest rates and the economic growth was slowing. Also combined mostly, it wasn't because the central banks were raising interest rates and economic growth. That's never the reason of the market going down. It's just a tuple upon reason. It's a reason upon different reasons. But what made the market go down was the canal crisis that sparked it with the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary. Most of all, the Suez Canal crisis. Soviet Union, because the U.S. has really nothing much involved with the Hungary. So, what was the cause of the stagflation? Central banks and raising interest rates and slower economic growth as well. The market, and you could see that the market went up, but why did the market go down? Well, because if we look at when was the Suez Canal crisis? October 25th, 1956. Yeah, so Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser seized control of the Suez Canal and nationalized it, sparking a crisis that later resulted in French, British, and Israeli forces briefly occupying parts of Egypt. This drawdown could be a cause of also central banks raising interest rates and also economic activity slowing. And probably another reason that I can't get information on because I've tried researching every year specifically, but there's probably the market never remember that the market is rational. It doesn't move exactly for a reason exactly, but it moves around an area of reasons. So an area of reason here I know is definitely from central banks raising interest rates and also the economic activity slowing. But I don't know another event that happened in here. Of course, that another event had to occur here in order for the market to come down because the market was already reacting towards this slowing down and it bottomed here. But yeah, it went down. But what happened in October during the Suez Canal, that was exactly on October 29th. That was actually over here. The market went up. It stayed still for about a month and it kept going up. You see, it wasn't even a Suez Canal. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of the industrial materials, especially with oil, was coming around the Suez Canal and they had a deal with the Egyptians in this canal with transportation, most of all transportation for products and industrial. And that affected, yet look what the markets did. Everyone who thought that was a big problem over here, well, the market went up and it went up a lot afterwards. A crisis like that. And having also central banks rising interest rates, economic activity slowing for months, and now this new Suez Canal crisis, yet the market bottomed and went up. There's no reason for it to bottom, right? In a retailer's eyes. But of course it's going to bottom. The market does not bottom when people want it to bottom. Neither does the market top when people want it to top. It tops really market makers is what pushes that price. It's that market maker who wants to get a cheaper price than what he paid for. So he finds a good moment when everyone's selling. He knows that after everyone has sold almost everything, he net buys because he gets to fill the bid and ask there. And he knows if he buys now and leads the price later, no one's going to buy at a price cheaper than him. Now, why is that important? Well, because as people buy in the markets, prices go up. So he wants to buy first, so he won't buy it higher when a person starts buying. So he wants to be the person sparking the buying, so then others have to be forced to buy it at a higher price, right? And that's why a market maker bottoms the price, and later when the market goes up, he shorts the price so he can scare people still to going into recession. And after going down, more selling, he buys again. So every time you see he buys is at a low. He bought here, 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 because he shorted. What he's net shorting is less compared to what he's longing. Obviously, because he's going long, he's going bullish completely in the market. That's why he's controlling it. Now, many people think that's why it's market manipulation, but they're required to do this. Because imagine if there's no control in the markets. It would be a complete utter chaos. You can't have that. Market manipulation is absolutely necessary. And it's existed for more than a century. And many people don't even know it still exists. So that's why, right? Because imagine going into the market and everything is without controls. You could have a Great Depression again. That's not an intelligent thing to do. It would lead to severe losses in corporations, leveraging into amounts that different corporations want to put into the market. And it's just a much more riskier area where people will not get much returns in, and it creates less returns for institutions. Is why would a person be interested in a market where the market crashes down for 3 years from an event in a crisis that's very cyclical and volatile? No, there has to be control where there's higher lows and higher highs. The drawdowns happen sharp, but don't happen for very long, and then afterwards, from the bottoming, the prices exceed enormously up. So you can see net long, even after the price goes down, you're sure enough to make more money. Even if it's the most horrible event, you're more likely to make money of market going up rather than coming down. Of course, you know this, but there's more chance of the market going up after coming down than it is to come down more. Because it's done that more than 90% of the times. Yeah, my bad. I got confused with the years. No, the Suez Canal was actually over here. Yeah, because this is, look, if you look at the date 1956, I was looking at 1957. This is 1956. The market went up, was already doing a rally, and the price went down. And yeah, people just reacted towards that. It did happen. But afterwards, even towards affecting transportation, along with slower economic growth and higher interest rates, the market went down for 2 months and it bottomed and went up. Right. And then now we're over here, July 1957. Okay, so let's see what happened. On 1957, so this was actually called the Eisenhower recession. The effect of the recession spread beyond the United States to Europe and Canada, causing many businesses to shut down. It was the most significant recession during the post-World War II boom, but let's see the actual cause. So there were major factors in the decline that exerted a growing downward pressure on production and employment, resulting in a general reduction of economic activity. That's specifically the Suez Canal, I'm pretty sure. So that affected supply chain issues because of industrial. It didn't affect it now because the people who got the supply months ago from in this section already have it now, and they still have massive amounts of supplies from previous orders to manufacture and produce. But as they produce and try to reorder again, they can't reorder or reorder the same price or reorder the same product because of that whole crisis going on with the Egypt with transportation holded, which was also a double top reason, another reason for the market to come down like this, because it affected it 7 months later. So new car sales took a sharp dive as the middle class consumers decided to keep their cars. This is what I was talking about, that many of these are soldiers from World War II, but the parents of baby boomers, they decided to keep their cars for longer instead of upgrading after a few years. Auto sales fell 31% over 1957, making 58 the worst auto year since World War II. In just 3 years, car sales fell from 8 million purchases in 55 to 4.3 million purchases in 58. In an effort to overcome declining auto sales, one of the hardest hit sectors of the slump, the Beer Death Soto dealership of St. Louis, put its salesman on duty for 64 hours straight as part of a sell-a-thon that raised sales. They had to forcefully work more hours to get the same payment of sales from cars because people decided to keep their cars. They didn't want to keep upgrading it. And that's what led to the sharp decline in demand for the car sales because they had inventory. And the inventory's cost. Now, housing construction, which I talked about earlier, slowed due to higher interest rates in 55 and 56. By 57, new house construction had fallen to about 1.2 million units, and the construction slowed down due to higher interest rates. Obviously, not much people want to take out a loan to get the house, especially that many of them already have a house, right? So they already most likely bought it. And people who wanted to buy a house later because they saw others buying, because that's how humans work. You do something because when others people are doing it, you feel more confident to do it because others are doing it well. And it's like sheep. It's a sheep-minded. And by higher interest rates, that demand depletes itself temporarily. There was a gradual decrease in income business of capital goods industries, which resulted in the ending of an expansive boom. The initial trouble began in 56 with a deceleration of business planning for replacement of equipment and expansion of manufacturing facilities, resulting in a drop in new orders for equipment. This created a widening gap between the supply and the use of industrial capacity. Federal Reserve economists believe that the Eisenhower administration had contributed to the recession by cutting back on the United States Department of Defense purchases in 1957. Oh, okay, that's why it's called the Eisenhower recession. So if it's called like that, then the main driver had to do with the decrease in incoming business of capital goods industries. So it was a decrease on capital goods industries. So capital goods, that has to do with really selling on asset management. I see that many of the businesses didn't scale in 56. They didn't decide to reallocate their capital into investing back to the business. It's really what I'm hearing from this. And that resulted in a drop in new orders for equipment, obviously, because that resulted in a stagnation or innovation for new products. And that led to slower consumption, slower demand. And that obviously had a wide gap with the supply and the use of that product, which was incentivized by the U.S. Department of Defense purchases. So I get it. The Eisenhower administration decided to keep back, not be so focused. They weren't focused in the purchases. So that's what led to this drawdown. That's what we're reading. And there was many reasons. You have really demand. It had to do with temporary consumption demand. But does the consumption of demand have to do with product demandment or economic demand because they're not of easy use to do it temporarily? Well, it's because of not easy use temporarily. People didn't buy new houses because people didn't want to buy new houses. They weren't urgent. It's not that they weren't urgent to buy new houses, because they were too expensive to buy new houses. Currently, not because the business charging for more expense because they're looking to make more money, or it's just because of economically, macroeconomic. And also car sales slumped because many people decided to keep their cars that they bought during the Korean War 6 years before, or a few years before, maybe 1955 or something like that. So it's not from the business. It's just people deciding to keep what they bought. But it's not they don't want to buy again because the products aren't good. That's the difference that I would just want to tell you so you can understand. And then, of course, the business side of incentivizing wasn't because of the business exactly. It was because of the Eisenhower part administration. Of course, it has to do with the business of mindset to repurchase them, but maybe it had to do with macroeconomic with higher interest rates. Of course, remember that many companies are not so incentivized to invest heavily when interest rates are higher because they can't get loans that easily or as attractively or any sort of leverage. So there will be companies that will definitely invest during bad economic times, but the amount of companies are much less to a good economic time. Now, in 1958 to 1959, what did the market do after this? The market went up completely. Of course. Look at all these problems. This is actually worse than 2022. Many people might say, like, really? Yeah, economically, yes. Because over here, at least right now, we're just dealing with a problem of inflation, right? But we don't have a problem with GDP. We don't have a problem with people not wanting to consume more. We also don't have a problem with geopolitically high tension with other countries. Of course, we have a problem with China, but we're not dealing with a physical war or nothing like that. And we're not dealing with high amounts of deficits to pay back, which they had to pay years before in 49 to 47, about almost 10 years ago. So that's why I believe that during this time it was worse, because over here you had high interest rates, slow economic growth, a problem with supply due with a crisis in another country. That supply was inevitably a problem. Right now, supply was a problem, but that was because of COVID, of type of employment. But you can resolve that in a way because it doesn't lead to future consequences. Because of course, it leads to future consequences if you don't correct the right way with the virus. If you don't get vaccines and a lot of this stuff, or restructure ways so people don't get affected. Back then, no, because you're dependent on a location. And now it depends solely if that location wants to keep lending you or allowing access towards their own canal. You have that on top of this stagnation with economic actual activity of people not wanting to consume in the short term. And it's not that they don't want to consume more later. It's because they don't need to right now because they've already bought what they should. And there people are still consuming. It's just that it wasn't because there wasn't consumption. It was just because businesses predicted were too overestimated the amount of demand, which overexceeded their inventory and had more supply with comparison of demand. And they had to put a lot of cost facing against them, which net in total brought those companies and the market down. But you could say that that's a huge advantage to buy a great business at a cheap price, because that has nothing to do with the business. It just has to do with inventory that they had a lot. And you're able to buy temporarily when everyone thinks that's a bad problem. And that would lead to this huge bull run that happened because of high inventory. So you see, like, many of these reasons, look at all the stuff that I just told you this year. This is much worse than 2022. Even with Ukrainian war and all this stuff, this is much worse than what's going on in 2022. Even with COVID. COVID has been a bit resolved. The more companies had inventory, they didn't invest as much. Not all the companies, but a few companies, right? Maybe that few companies were companies that existed back in the 30s and 40s that just existed and were barely surviving in World War II and are now surviving and trying to provide. I call these normally like the side-buy companies that aren't doing anything significant, like Intel, which is right now, or Samsung. And they're just trying to keep themselves alive. And some, although Intel is not, I wouldn't compare it to these companies. Intel's a bit more intelligent into that. But let's say that Intel was like this, that they didn't want to invest more money. And there was many companies like Intel that got created back in after Great Depression, right? And then had to go through the World War II and try to survive that scenario in their business, and now are still alive. And looking at this now, many in their inventory, they faced inventory with demand. Demand wasn't much as they anticipated, and they had to survive a bit of revenue decreases and hopefully a lot of these companies didn't have high debts, or let's say certain things in their statements that they would have to amortize, right? Many companies did. probably a lot of companies that went bankrupt. So you see, like, there could be different reasons. That's why this is much more worse than what's going on now. But yet, despite all this, pretty sure no one was anticipating that over here, about 6 months later, the market would do this. See, like, 3 days later, they just bottomed. Have that really in your mindset. You got to think about when the market's crashing, every single time when you least expect it, 3 days later might be the bottom. Because look at what happened here. When the most selling over here, 2 days later, the market bottomed and went up from there. Big selling, the market went up from here. Big selling, the market went up from here. Big selling, the market went up from here. So you see, it's not, this is why, and I'm going to keep saying it, and I think it now probably annoys a few people, but I'm going to keep saying it, that the market does not behave because of economic activities. It doesn't behave because of wars. It doesn't behave because you want it to behave. It doesn't behave from high interest rates. It doesn't behave on anything. It behaves when it wants it to, when least of all people want it to, because of consumption. When you restrict, an area is more restricted for consumption, the more likely they want to consume. And the more likely the doors are slightly open for access. When more customers get in, that governance of the door opens the door more because they don't have the problems as much and they're able to offset the inflation before, because the inflation has come down. Now they're able to give economic growth. But on top of that, most of all, is because of market maker. Because that stuff will happen much later on in the months. And even when that stuff is happening, a lot of times the market goes down. So that's why I say it's not macroeconomic. It's technical in the short term. In the long term, it really is at any time. Because in the long term, the market's going to be, I know that the market in 10 years from now is going to have more than a 200% gain. That means the market's right now $400. I will say without a doubt that the S&P 500, that is at $4,000, is going to be at $12,000 10 years later. Right? And it's going to keep doing that until it gets to the Dow Jones and exceeds this. And, many people are not going to believe me, but, that's the part of the world. There's going to be always people like that until later in the future they realize the mistake. And that's where Charlie Munger says, and also Benjamin Graham says that, you're not right because people agree with you or disagree with you. You're right because your facts are right. And Charlie had a friend that told him, Charlie, think about what I told you and you agree with me because you're smart and I'm right. And that's what I think right now. You can be as smart as you want, right? But this isn't about being smart either. And I know eventually, because you are smart, you're going to understand that I'm right, what I'm saying here. Now, 1960. Market went down by 2.6%. So the GDP of the US fell 1.4%. The recession ended in November 1960. Unemployment rate did not peak for several months. The rate reached its height for the cycle of 7.1. Wow, that's a huge percentage. See, there's always problems, guys. Look, 3 years ago, there was a Suez Canal. There was a goddamn Federal Reserve monetary policy tightness. There was a drawdown in high amounts of inflation. You had the Korean War. You had too much liberal and price controls. 15 years ago, the World War II. There's always problems. And look at where we're at now. When you think all these problems are going by and you think how ridiculous the problems are going on now, the market's at $680. You remember when it was at $180? And you remember before when it was at $40? None of this stuff matters what's going on right now. None of it matters if you're holding for the long term. None of it matters. And nothing what Wall Street tells you matters. Neither does the most billionaire person in the world tell you that there's going to be a recession. Neither of 10 billionaires tell you that there's going to be a recession. And neither of I or Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger or anyone you admire tells you there's going to be a recession. Why? Because you are right, not because other people agree with you or disagree with you. Or let me add to that, you are neither right because another person agrees with them or disagrees with them. You are solely right because your facts are right. No matter how intelligent another person is, no matter how much experience they have, facts. It's just facts, right? A lot of people are not going to do this because a lot of people are not programmed this way. But you can always reprogram yourself. And that's what I want you to do with this. That's why I love going through history, because it teaches you a huge lesson that the market does not behave in the long term towards macroeconomically. No, it doesn't. I don't care any arguments anyone could give to me, because at the end of the day, I think those people are adding too much technical parts that are irrelevant in ways towards what actually provides the market's incentive to move towards the rate it's done. The market has not moved in a certain way it has for the past decades because of macroeconomics. The market has moved in a certain way because of consumption that never dies, and it's never been dying ever since 1930. And that's going to keep happening ever, and that's net bullish for the US. But still, like, all these problems, and now there's a new problem, right? What's this other? It's just the same story. Like, Well, other problem again. And many people might interfere this like as problematic, but it's not problematic. It's not problematic because it's an opportunity. What's the opportunity here? You're able to buy at a cheaper price, and you're able to buy when more people are going to likely sell, and on top of that, from more selling, it's going to more likely go up. So it's such a great way, and in a way, hopefully it stays this way. I know it sounds sort of weird, but hopefully it stays that way, because when the market goes down, you're buying at a cheaper price, and there's more probability that the market's going to go up. Like, what investment can you get anywhere that's like that? When you're buying something that's worth 80% of what it's worth, and when it goes up immediately at a ridiculous rate that you're able to make 100% in probably 3 months. And you're able to make 1,000% in a few years. I've seen a company do that. There's nothing. That's why I love the stock market, because I take advantage of that irrationality. I take advantage of people selling me cheaper prices, and I just say, okay, I know that they're completely wrong. That's why I buy it, right? My sellers are heroin addicts. That's what Warren Buffett said, that it's no different if you had a farm and some crazy heroin addict neighbor comes to your door every day and always tries to give an auction into what price your farm is. I mean, if your farm is worth $100,000, where you know that you produce X amount of soybeans, X amount of corn, and all these type of things, and you know from all this you can really get the inherent intrinsic value from the farm, and you know how you can produce in X amount of time and sell it towards an appropriate market. But if the farmer says that he wants to buy the farm for you now at $80,000 when you know it's worth $1 million, right? You bought it at $100,000. Would you really sell it to the farmer? If the next day the farmer tells you, like, your business is not as worth it as it was yesterday, it's now $50,000, are you still going to sell just because he's telling you it's $50,000? No. And if he tells you tomorrow that your business, like, you are actually crazy and you are completely irrational if you don't agree to what he's selling you at $20,000, are you still going to sell it to him even if the whole world tells you what you bought is worthless, because it's telling you that it wants to sell you at that price? No, because you know what the business is worth. So after this whole episode of the farmer happens, later in the long term, in 3 years, that farmer is going to start to ask you in the same sort of volatile way, but his range of prices starts to exceed towards the valuation of a farm, because it produces more and more as time goes on. So the farmer will always auction your price based on short-term fluctuations, on little stupid events that could happen in your farm. Whether there was an elk that came to your farm and it crashed a fence and it started eating a few crops, or whether some soybean didn't get properly fertilized in one area of the crop. Like, it's just, and he offers you 75% less than what the farm's worth. Like, you see, it doesn't make sense. And that's the way how the market works. And all these people who are heroin addicts, that's the market's comprised of more than 90% of these people. Of course, this is amazing for people like me and people like you, because I know net in total that I'm always going to win in this game, because I don't have to be intelligent. I just have to know different patterns that no one else wants to do, because everyone doesn't want to stay with facts to look at things rationally, because everyone wants to put the fun about it. But I don't even care about the fun. I just want to make money. That's the only point about investing. In investing, you're only focused on what you're paying now is to get more of what you're paying. There's nothing about magic about investing. That's all the point about investing. And I say this to everyone who talks to me and asks me about the market, because I know they know how involved I'm in the market. And I always tell them the same thing. The only time that's right to buy in the market is any time, right? And that's the expectation you put into it. If you're looking to make money in the short term, good luck to you. I don't have the response to that exactly. And you can get a response to Wall Street, but they're selling you. You know, they're selling you. Other people who are selling other courses are doing that, right? You would do that with trading, but you have to understand what you're doing. That's why I have a trading course, because it utilizes a system, and that one does work, because I know I have probabilities. I'm not saying that when I enter a trade, I'm sure to win. No, I'm actually very sure I'm going to lose. And I'm also sure that I might win. But I have a system that I know what on what I lose is less to what I win in overall, right? I have a very a casino way of trading. Not the people who are betting the casino, but I'm the casino. I know whether the person who's betting in my table are going to lose in the long run, because I fixed the game like that. And that's the way how I go about in trading. That's why net in total in trading, I will do well. Right? But I never go into this mindset like the bettor, who I think I'm going to win every single moment, and I bet more because I win more. You lose like that. And I don't do this in the markets either. And I strongly advise you to not do that either.